So I'm really excited for Kyle to share his career story and how he created Decarbon. So I will let you take it away.
Cool. Thanks. I'll do thank you all for listening to my story and my journey. I'm excited to tell you all about it. What I was thinking I would do is just do a super quick overview of my app. And then I'll hop over to a different slide deck that has more information about like my journey to deciding to build Decarbon. And if you're interested in thinking about creating an app yourself, what kind of thought process maybe you could go through. And also there's this one framework for thinking about career stuff in general that I really like that I'll tell you about too. But yeah, at any point within this presentation hybrid, feel free to drop a question in the chat or just ask it live. I'm very happy to make this presentation whatever is most interesting to you all. Oh, sorry, we're getting an Amber Alert. Okay, and you can see my screen? Okay, cool. Quick rundown on Decarbon. So Decarbon is a app that I've been building since 2020. Like Ali mentioned, I've been teaching myself how to code. This has been basically like a passion project for the last few years. And recently, basically at the start of 2022, I've been trying to make it my full-time gig. So it's kind of like in this like side hustle phase right now. Kind of the big problem statement that I think about for this is the question of how do we help anyone feel like they can actually do something about climate change? So I'm sure you all know climate anxiety is this kind of growing concern. Did my audio cut out? Can you hear me okay?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, sweet. Climate anxiety is this growing concern for everybody. I have generally really struggled, even majoring in environmental science, I've generally struggled with like, how do I actually fit into this really massive problem? It seems like individuals can't really do very much about climate change. I don't really know where to begin, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very like massive problem that I think can be really disempowering for a lot of people because it does get really technical. It does get into things that maybe we don't necessarily have direct control over. So it's this big issue. This is a screenshot of my app. This is the carbon budgeting tab. So kind of the big thing that we're trying to do with Decarbon is empower anybody to be able to take action. And carbon budgeting is like the big vehicle for that. So you could basically track your carbon footprint over time. And the mechanism for that is free and open source carbon tracking. So you can track your footprint based on your purchases. And the estimations that Decarbon is making for your carbon emissions is all open source. So there's this database on GitHub that you can go to like see all of the calculations that Decarbon is using. And we also have like different tips within the app too. So there's this list of like climate actions that you can take. It's personalized to you. People can like different tips so you can see what the most popular climate actions are within the app. And then finally, you can get carbon credits. So carbon credits are kind of a newer, actually carbon credits have been around for a while, but they've kind of been getting more attention, I would say, in the last few years with the understanding that we can only reduce our carbon footprint so much, like everybody, including individuals, companies, governments, everyone's gonna have some unavoidable carbon emissions. And so we need to have some type of carbon removal, carbon crediting mechanism to be able to get us as close to net zero as possible to start to reverse climate change. The last slide here that I'll share is this study that was done by Yale's program on climate change communication. Basically shows that climate change is becoming a growing concern for people, even in the last 5 years. It's roughly been, I guess, 50% of America is alarmed or concerned, but the portion of Americans who are just straight up alarmed about climate change has grown from 18% in 2017 to now 33%. This was done last year in 2021. So that's kind of like when I'm designing the app, those are the people that I'm thinking about, the people who are like really triggered by climate change, basically, and are really like motivated to take personal action. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour of Decarbon, but I don't want to get too into the weeds with you all. But any general questions about the app that I could share?
I have a question. In addition to tracking purchases, does Decarbon also track emissions from transportation? Like if someone decided to fly across the country on a trip?
Yeah, cool. Is it Farron?
Farron.
Farron, cool. Thanks for the question, Farron. Yeah, that's an awesome question. So the way Decarbon tracks transportation emissions is also through those purchases. So for example, if you fly from LA to New York, that's going to cost you, I don't know, something like $500. And that'll be captured as a purchase where for every dollar spent in the airlines category, there's a certain amount of emissions. So that's how it kind of scales. Like an international flight that's $1,000 will be more emissions than a flight from LA to San Francisco that's only $100. So it all ties back to purchases, which is kind of nice. And the thinking behind that is, although it's less accurate than typing in maybe how many miles your flight was or something like that, it's a little bit more convenient for people who maybe don't have like the time or like don't want to put that much investment into tracking every single detail of their footprint. But yeah, you can track like bus tickets, Uber rides, train rides, all of those things require some type of purchase. And if, for example, like your parents are buying your plane ticket or something like that, you can manually add that into the app too. It doesn't have to be like directly from a purchase that you made to be able to track it. Thank you. That's such a good question.
And on that note, from just off the top of your head, would you say that airline travel, like air travel, is like a relatively high carbon activity? So they would end up being like a higher amount per dollar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think air and gas are like the top two carbon intensive activities. It kind of changes based on like just the general price of those things. Like for example, on a per dollar basis, going to the grocery store is more carbon intensive than like $1 spent at a restaurant. But that's also because like the amount of food you can get with $100 at your grocery store is more than like the amount of food you can get at a restaurant. So there's some things that are kind of controlled by just like how expensive things are as well. Yeah, food, fuel, and flights. Those are like the top three things for people. Yeah. Cool. All right, I'll jump to the other slide deck. There were 3 slides here that I thought were good to share. So I just thought I'd share my path since college. And actually, I understand that you all are high school students. So maybe I'll start with high school, just so it's like a little bit like from the beginning of my journey, so to speak. I actually honestly really fell in love with the environment and sustainability. So I grew up in the Bay Area. My family would do tons of trips to Lake Tahoe in the summer and winter. I ran cross country in high school, so you're spending a lot of time outside. I went to school in San Francisco, so we're like going to the beach a lot, going to Golden Gate Park all the time, Lake Merced. So that's kind of how I was just like exposed to the outdoors and thought that there was kind of this like magic to being in nature. So that's kind of my roots, I would say. In high school, there was this elective class that I took that was called Nature Nexus, which was basically like this fusion class between like learning about environmental sustainability. It's where I've learned about climate change for the first time. And also reading like poetry from different writers, reading different kind of like writings from climate activists for the first time. And it was paired with like weekly field trips too. It was this really cool kind of like interdisciplinary course that got me kind of like aware of and a little starting to get concerned about climate change. At the time, it was like this growing issue, but we didn't realize how serious it was back in 2010 when I was taking the class. But that made me realize when I got into UCLA, when I applied as an international economics major to UCLA. But when I showed up for orientation, it was like your one opportunity to like quickly switch majors. And I knew I wanted to switch into environmental science. So I did it like right during orientation week. So I majored in environmental science at UCLA. I got a environmental systems and society minor, which is like the humanities / like policy minor for that major. And I also minored in Chinese. I grew up learning Chinese. But at school, it was honestly where I got the most experience around, I would say like environmental communications and public engagement. Dare I say a little bit of marketing was in the student orgs that I was in. So I was in a lot of the like environmental student groups on campus. There was different kind of research teams that you could be a part of for different aspects of sustainability on campus. There was a farmers market that I helped to run my last 2 years at UCLA. There was this concert we put on that was like a bike powered concert called Ecochella to, you know, educate people on one form of renewable energy, which is like literally kinetic energy of people riding bikes to power this stage. So those, I would say, like, yeah, Ecochella was the best. The extracurricular activities for me, honestly, were like as valuable, if not more valuable, for me understanding like what I wanted to do around climate change and what I was kind of like, what I kind of gravitated towards, what I was kind of good at too. Was more of this like communications, public engagement type of like space within climate change or environmental science, because environmental science can also include things like chemical oceanography and like atmospheric science and physics, and chemistry was my worst class ever for sure. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Like environmental science is this hugely broad topic that covers so many things, which is incredible because you learn a lot of stuff, but it was honestly challenging for me to really know like what I could specialize in, and also what I could specialize in, and also just like knowing what my career path could be, like what job I could get with it. That's definitely a challenge with environmental science majors.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'll just interject for a sec and remind
Please.
the students that 2 weeks ago we had a group of environmental scientists speak, and now they study basically pollution that comes from terrestrial sources and how and ends up in the ocean, like plastic, chemicals, like sediment, a lot of things. And so I think it's interesting to see how, like, you know, having the base in environmental science can lead to so many different,
Yeah.
or, you know, end points or just jobs along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And they try to make the minors, my systems and society minor is like the humanities leaning one, and then there's environmental engineering for folks who are more interested in kind of like larger scale civil engineering type of projects that relate to the environment. There's a few other ones, but I can't quite remember what they are now. But that helps a little bit with like helping students to kind of like understand what direction they want to go in. But environmental consulting is another common one. For me, actually, so what I did after I graduated UCLA was I taught abroad in China for 2 years. For a few reasons. primarily, I had no idea what I was going to do after I graduated college, and I needed some space to think about it. And I was really busy in college doing my extracurriculars, and honestly, just like enjoying my last, year as a student. Um, so I had no clue what job I could get out of college. So Teach for China was a fellowship teaching program in rural China where I taught English for 2 years. I also saw it as a way to spend some time volunteering before I have like this huge like financial burden and like have a whole career and stuff like that. This was kind of my opportunity to just be a volunteer, to see the world, to travel. I had never studied abroad in college too, so I kind of wanted to do something study abroad-esque. But yeah, I had a great time in China. I met some really incredible people, coworkers, students. I taught middle school primarily, but then also a group of high schoolers as part of like an English language club. But that did give me the space to think about what I was interested in. And it was still around environmental science, but I realized I was specifically interested in like businesses that are into climate change. And kind of the buzzword at the time for those types of businesses were called clean tech companies. So I was interested in clean tech. The work I did in 2016 with Asia Society was basically looking at creating a list of all of the clean tech companies in California and seeing how they could potentially enter the Chinese market. So it was this big kind of survey talking to all of these different clean tech companies, including like the CEOs and founders sometimes, and tackling this also kind of like convoluted question of like, what if you did want to help China reduce their air pollution? What could entering the Chinese market look like for your business? But that led me, Asia Society is a nonprofit, but that research led me to my first kind of like job in a for-profit clean tech company. That's Pick My Solar on the right-hand side here. I joined Pick My Solar as a business analyst, and I don't know, it was just like my first experience in kind of like the cliche tech startup environment where you're like working really hard. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of people coming and going. But it was a really great learning opportunity for me. And I realized that in a weird way, my environmental science background really helped with some of the marketing elements of this company. Like their whole mission was to empower people to go solar. And so a lot of the educational materials that I came up with for Pick My Solar had a nice kind of adjacent quality to the stuff that I was learning in my environmental science program at UCLA. But yeah, within Pick My Solar, I basically became the head of marketing. And that led me to where I was at Magoosh, which was back in kind of education, but this time for an ed tech company. Ed tech is like education tech. But I basically did marketing at Magoosh. Yeah, honestly, it was like my wife and I, we were moving to the Bay Area. Bay Area is super expensive. I need a new job. So Magoosh was kind of like just a really random company that I found on Indeed. But it ended up being the best company that I've ever worked for. That it was just such an incredible people culture. I learned a ton from kind of like my peers who were also marketing managers there. I think most importantly, they were really great during COVID, and we're really understanding of like how all of our lives were being incredibly disrupted during this period. And a really nice silver lining to COVID was it gave me the time to really focus on my passion, which turned into Decarbon. Essentially, during COVID, I didn't have to commute. My office was 10 feet away from my bed, and it still is. But I basically had that hour and a half when I would normally be riding BART into Berkeley. I had that hour and a half to teach myself how to write code and build apps. I knew I wanted to build Decarbon ever since like 2017, but I never had the time and like the resolve to build it. But Decarbon, even though I committed to doing it at the start of 2020, once March and April rolled around and the shelter in place stuff really got going, that's when I was like really committed to learning how to build Decarbon, and really that's when the gears got going. And that could have never happened if Magoosh wasn't so understanding and accommodating as well. So I feel really lucky about that. And so I left Magoosh at the very end of 2021. I've been doing freelance marketing since then. Essentially, the freelancing pays bills while I'm able to work on Decarbon without being stressed about like, how is Decarbon as a climate change business going to actually be making money? How do I reconcile, wanting to really help people do something about climate change with the very real need to make an income and sustain myself? So that's like the balance that I've been holding for the last 6 months, basically, is half of my time doing freelancing and half of my time working on Decarbon and growing it and talking to people about it. But the freelancing is great because I'm working with clients that I really like. One is called Kiva. They're a nonprofit that does microloans all over the world for people who normally aren't able to access financing. And a lot of those include eco-friendly loans, which are like loans for people to get solar panels or switch to less polluting cook stoves in different countries. So there's this nice kind of like overlap between what I'm learning in my freelancing and what I'm learning in my startup world with Decarbon. So that is that's the whirlwind tour of my career. Any thoughts, questions, things that need to be clarified? It's not the most interesting thing, honestly.
Oh, I disagree. Yeah, any questions from the group? I have questions if you don't, but I like to let the students ask.
Yeah, totally. And feel free to just ask in the chat too, if you don't want to unmute. I totally get it.
All right, well, while they're thinking, I just would ask a broad question, which is, looking back at the path you took, is there anything you would do differently?
That is a great question. Yeah, I think the only thing I would do differently is start Decarbon sooner. I got the idea, I'm kind of guesstimating, but I think in like 2017, 2018. And I basically sat on it for 3-ish years. And I was definitely really busy, and like it's not like such a big deal, I guess, when the exact timing of it is. But I think like I've had such a rewarding experience building Decarbon since 2020, and it would have been cool to start it sooner, even if it was just like a little bit here and there, moving it in that direction. So that's like a minor regret, but everything's working out okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're coming off of last week, we had a big presentation about like college decisions. So I'm glad you talked a little bit about like how you decided your major. I'm curious about like how you decided specifically to go to UCLA. And then just a follow-up on like the process of changing your major. It is possible to change your major like later in the game, right? You don't have to know from day one like you did.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so and Margaret, I see your question in the chat here. My role was growth marketing manager at Magoosh. So there's a lot of like product testing and like site optimization. Yeah. So as far as my like thinking around going to school, it was kind of a combination of like what my parents honestly wanted me to do and like what I wanted to do. My parents were pretty set on me attending a school in California, primarily for the in-state tuition purposes. Basically, like if I wanted to go to school on the East Coast or somewhere else, it just would have been like a lot more expensive, something like at the time, $20,000 extra per year or something like that. And it's probably even more now. So I knew I needed to go to school somewhere in California. I went on just like a driving tour with my dad and my brother. I want to say my junior year in high school, to different universities in California, just kind of getting a vibe for each of the campuses. And we didn't even do any of the official tours, but it just gave me a sense of what campuses I liked the best and what student life was like in each of them. And UCLA definitely stood out to me at the time. It just felt like the most classic college experience with like the beautiful brick buildings and stuff like that. I was just honestly enamored by like the landscaping essentially of UCLA. But that kind of put it up there for me. I only applied to 4 schools: UCLA, UC Berkeley, UCSB, and UC San Diego. Those were the 4 ones that I applied to. And it was really close between like Berkeley and UCLA for me, but I wasn't accepted into Berkeley. So I was like, okay, my decision has been made for me. I'll attend UCLA. And that was that, basically. It was nice for me that I only applied to UCs because I didn't also have to do the Common App. I like only had to do the UC app. I did not great on the SAT, and then I did pretty good on the ACT. So I submitted my ACT scores. But yeah, as far as once you're in school, so I switched right at orientation from economics to environmental science. And I basically hit the ground running with that and never really looked back. I didn't consider other majors really. Sorry, I have to sneeze. Excuse me, sorry about that. Usually I mute beforehand, but that came on too quick. Yeah, but all that to say, students absolutely can switch majors pretty much at any point. It gets harder once you're in your junior and senior year, because you're going to be taking more like specialized classes for whatever your major at the time was. But I do know a lot of people who start undecided in college, and then they basically settle on their major once they take a few classes, do their prerequisites for the entire college, stuff like that. Once they kind of like have dabbled in a range of different classes, they can then know which one to pick. So there is a lot of flexibility within like a couple guardrails, like wanting to graduate in 4 years and only being allowed to take so many classes. And then minoring is always a great option. So I minored in Chinese because I wanted to maintain my Chinese. And then that helped me go to Teach for China. So I'm glad I kind of kept that going. But that's always an option if you're like just interested in so many things. A minor is always a great way to get that additional experience.
So a related question, given that you ended up learning to code kind of independently from school, if there are students who are in high school now and they already know they're interested in coding or software engineering or that kind of thing, I think it's become a lot more kind of reasonable to not go to college and just go straight into that route. So I'm curious if you have like other pros and cons, I guess, about going to college in general instead of just pursuing like computer science outside of college.
Wow, that's fascinating. I feel like, in 2010, when I graduated high school, that really wasn't an option, or it was like the bleeding edge of like something you could do after high school. There are things, though, I'm aware of that are like coding boot camps, basically, which is like an accelerator into a career in computer science and into software engineering. I don't know what the details would be for someone who just graduated high school, but typically they're like 3 to 6 months long, and then they guarantee that you get some job in a software company at the end of it. And then it's really expensive, but it's not that long. It's like probably less expensive than going to college for sure. As far as the pros and cons for going to college, I guess I'll frame it that way. I think the pro is, I mean, to our previous points, like there's a high likelihood that I could have switched majors and had a completely different interest if I got really into some other thing in college. Like I think back then my mindset was like still very much like unsettled. I had no idea I would be in marketing, for my career when I was in college. So I think college and universities in general do give you that like playground and sandbox and like flexibility, to like change things around. That's definitely a pro. There's also just like the quintessential college experience that I think is really great too, socially, as far as meeting people from really different backgrounds as you, and being able to, participate in all of these different events and activities, and honestly parties, and just like great life experiences that college provides you. It also maybe more tactically, it does give you like a pretty solid network of people to connect with for the rest of your life. So I definitely don't stay in touch with like all of my college friends, but it is like a base where you can always have like interesting things in the future. Maybe you end up working together on something, like literally Allison and I with this presentation right now, or other things like that. It does give you like that great network. Cons wise, I would say like cost is definitely an issue. Student loans are like so tragic, and it's just like a huge inequality and inequity, and it's kind of crazy that that's like the situation that our country has come to. But all that said, yeah, like I think there's probably ways to, in addition to student loans, as I guess like a bit of a last resort, there are ways to like soften the blow, I suppose, around the cost of going to college. I did have a lot of friends at UCLA who, for example, started with 2 years in community college, which is like free or really inexpensive, and then transferred to UCLA in their junior year. My sister actually transferred into UCLA in her junior year. So there's like ways to kind of like make up for that pretty significant con in college. Yeah, that's honestly the biggest con I can think of. I don't know. Do you have any other ones to add, Allison?
No, I mean, I'd say cost really is the only disadvantage. And then as far as other pros, I think you mentioned this earlier when you were talking, but the extracurricular activities you can get into at college are, things that likely you wouldn't have in high school. And I, for example, ended up getting a lot more into singing in college, which I feel like had a lot of mental health benefits that I'm actually missing now as an adult. Like just those experiences of like harmonizing with people, like that's something that I had. And just having it like built-in structure of student organizations that you can join. Because once you're out of the school system and you're just operating as a normal adult in life, there's a lot less structure for you to meet people and find those activities that you want to do.
Yeah, that's a great one for sure. Yeah, it is definitely a lot harder to find those things when you're working 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. There is something magic to like just how in college you're living in like a 1 mile, or I guess like 3 mile radius of like your 300 friends or whatever number, you know what I mean? It's just like never again will you be in that type of space where there's just like a high concentration of like really good friends who you're just like crossing on the sidewalk and like chatting with them for even just like 2 minutes, that type of thing is like when you bump into a friend now as an adult, it's like, oh my God, just like changes your day. It like affects your day so profoundly.
Right.
But in
Very
college,
much.
it was like, whatever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's even, and at this, actually, we talked a little last week about big versus small colleges. And I think the point was made that obviously at a smaller school, you're more likely to know everyone. But honestly, even at a really big school, you'd be surprised at just like
Mhm,
walking around campus, I would always run into people I knew. And, UCLA
mhm,
is huge.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, UCLA is like 20,000 undergraduate students, I believe. And like the campus community is like 40,000 or something crazy like that. But yeah, you bump into people all the time. Kind of just, there's like those main thoroughfares, where you'll see people. And I think you're also anchored by like the extracurricular activities that you're doing and your classes. Like a lot of my good friends now, I also took like a lot of environmental science classes with, so I'd see them like 3 times a week for that. And then once you're a senior with them, you're like taking all the same classes together for the entire year, that kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah. So I still have some more questions for discussion, but want to take a minute to see if anyone else has questions that have come up in the meantime.
Oh, I had a question about the environmental science major. So I know I've personally kind of gotten more interested recently in environmental advocacy. And I was wondering, from your experience in an environmental science major, do you think that's a good path for people who want to pursue environmental advocacy? Or are there other majors that seem to kind of lend themselves more to that
Mm.
like topic?
Hmm. Totally. That is an amazing question. I think it would absolutely be valuable for somebody who's interested in environmental activism and advocacy to have a background in environmental science, basically just because you would have that like increased level of fluency around like talking about scientific issues like climate change at its core. Well, it touches on so many different subjects, but science is obviously like the number one thing, and one of the biggest rallying cries in climate activism is to listen to scientists, and to like believe in science. So I think having a foundation in science, specifically environmental science, could be hugely beneficial. And I will say, like, starting Decarbon, even though it's like a tech company, I think the fact that I do have a degree in environmental science is like a pro, or like a good thing for people to see, both like potential investors, but also potential users. Like it kind of gives myself, I think, a little bit more of a validation. That being said, I think there are definitely other majors that would be really valuable for somebody who's interested in more kind of like of the activism side of things. Political science comes to mind, like how do we basically, political science, I don't really know because I didn't major in it, but it does seem like it's like how are we structuring our political society, and how do we affect change, and how has that changed over the years throughout history. And so I think, with climate change, that's such a huge critical question. Like, how do we pass the laws that we need to actually do something about climate change? There's this like systemic challenge that is like so much greater than like what we as like sole individuals can do, right? So I think knowing kind of like what those pathways are would be really critical too. And that probably is, yeah, like political science. I could see economics being a portion of it too, where it's like capitalism. Did capitalism cause climate change? Like there's definitely an economic question to climate, or to climate advocacy as well. I would say that's just like the beauty of climate change, is it does touch on so many different fields. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just voice aloud what I said in the chat right now, which is, besides political science and economics, also like psychology and human behavior are really fascinating to study. Just because if you're trying to help change people's opinions or behaviors, like you need to know the underlying ways that happens, like how to influence people. As well as like sociology, which honestly, I don't know a ton about like what sociology actually is, but study of human societies, I guess. And
Right.
like history and government are useful if you want to go into the politics route as well, or just like policy making. Which by the way, there some people focus more on like actually writing policy, and then while other people can end up being actually in politics, like the legislators. That's kind of like two different things that are happening behind the scenes in government. And then there's the idea of just like marketing and communications and even arts. Like some people in, you know, documentary makers or journalists are really have devoted their careers to environmental issues. And that's a way to advocate as well.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Yeah, this is an awesome list. Yeah, I was gonna add, I think a major is obviously like an important component to your life. But I would also add that it gets less and less important the older you get, if that makes sense. Like, I know a lot of people who majored in something in college and now do something completely different for their career. Like, I have a friend who majored in history who's now like a product manager for a tech company. Yeah, like I think it definitely flavors your career, but it by no means needs to be like, okay, you majored in civil engineering, now you're going to go be a civil engineer. It does not need to be that way at all. Yeah, that's a great question though. Yeah, I have a couple more slides I could show too. That could be interesting.
go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think I showed this to your UPortland group, but this is kind of just my 2 cents on basically this is how I think about my career a lot, is this fancy like 4-way Venn diagram. It's called Ikigai. It's this Japanese concept around like finding a reason for being. So each of these colors, each of these circles is like a different value that you could care about. They're kind of just suggested things. But what they suggest is thinking about what you love to do, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and then what you are good at. And so ideally you're able to capture all of those things within your career. And if you do, that's called Ikigai. So for example, for me with Decarbon, like I love building apps. It's like super fun for me, and the world needs to do something about climate change. And I find that I'm actually pretty good at creating things and marketing them and talking to people about them, but I cannot be paid for Decarbon right now. So I'm not satisfying that bottom circle. So I guess as far as what that overlap is, that's like this top sort of brown colored one, and it says delight and fullness, but no wealth. And that is where I am right now. So this blue circle is being satisfied by my freelance marketing. Yeah. Yeah, I think these 2 points are helpful too. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Like, it's always good to do things patiently and evenly than like super rushed, you know. And then loving what you're doing really helps. So like if you're committed to something, you're more likely to like stick around and kind of like grind through it and come to that sort of catharsis. It takes time. Yeah. That's Ikigai.
I was just wondering a little bit about the like teaching in China thing that you did. Could you just like talk a little bit more about that? And like how you got it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Teach for China was amazing. Have you heard of Teach for America by any chance? So Teach for China is like the sister program, or I guess cousin program to Teach for America, where it's like similar concept, but it has this international angle where they're pairing teaching fellows from China who grew up in China, maybe in like more urban areas, and American fellows, and placing them in different rural schools within China, which are typically kind of like seriously underserved areas, also usually in like very ethnically diverse areas. Where I taught at in Yunnan province is like in the southwest of China, near Thailand, near Tibet, near India, like this very ethnically diverse sort of region of China, actually the most diverse region of China. So it was just this, this school where you would normally never see a foreign teacher. Like foreign teachers are pretty common in like Shanghai, Beijing, maybe less so now with like COVID and stuff. But yeah, at the time, you know, for a lot of our placements, you would be like the only foreigner in that village, literally. So it was kind of a crazy exposure, both for the students to like be able to interact with someone who had a completely different lived experience as them, and also for the teachers to be just like completely isolated from anything they knew. And at times, kind of COVID shelter in place reminded me of my time in China, where like I was just alone for like really long periods of time. Like definitely the biggest con with that whole experience was like you are very lonely. But you see your friends on like the weekends, you can travel a lot. You really have this like freedom to, I took bus rides everywhere around my province to meet up with like other co-fellows or other friends. But it was just a great thing to do, I think, in between college and work. Like when I got back from Teach for China, I was honestly really stressed out because the rest of my friends, it felt like had sort of like a 2-year head start on me on their careers, you know, like they're 2 years into working at X company, you know, whereas I'm like 2 years into teaching, which is useful. And I think it's an amazing story to take. But it felt like it was like, okay, now what do I do? Like, what can I actually do with this background, this like 2-year experience that I had? So that was kind of like my fear when I got back. But I think as I've kind of gotten older and I've gone through a few cycles of working at different places of my own over the last 6 years, I've come to like really appreciate the experience that I had with Teach for China, because I like would have a really hard time doing that right now, basically. I'm just too old now. No. Did that answer your question though? Any other things around Teach for China you were curious about?
Yeah, it did. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering more about that. So yeah, thanks.
Sweet. Yeah.
I had a question. I was wondering about like was there anything that you weren't
The most surprising thing has been like the best thing, I would say, which is that I think people can pick up on your like passion for something and your like drive to pursue something. And I think if you build your organization, doesn't necessarily have to be a startup, it could be a nonprofit or an advocacy group or anything like that. But I think if you build it with like good intentions and like a good kind of vision, basically, and people kind of see that, there's been this really nice, just organic, like, you're doing something cool, I want to help, or like, you're doing something that I'm kind of curious to learn more about, I'd love to talk to you. And vice versa. Like, I think it's also given me like this great way to reach out to people who I would otherwise be like really shy to reach out to or something like that. Or like, you know, it gives me that like mechanism, I think, to connect with more people. So that's been like a real pleasant surprise. It's like, oh, wow, I'm able to meet really cool people. And actually, it's so validating when people will message me and be like, I like what you're doing and I want to help. And that's something very unexpected that has been like really, really great. Yeah, a lot of gratitude for that.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
For sure. Yeah, I could share like a bad surprise too, if you like.
Yeah, sure. Both good and bad.
Bad surprise. Well, I shouldn't be this surprised because this is what everybody says. but it is really hard to to build a business. And like, I think, you know, I've put a few years into Decarbon already, but it is not like a profitable enterprise. It's not like people are trying the app and just like so obsessed with it that they're like posting to the world that they need to download Decarbon and try it, that kind of thing. Like it's not going viral or anything like that. And of course, like my expectation is that it is going to be really hard to do something along those lines. But that is kind of the thing that keeps me up at night, is like, when is this, or will this ever become something that like can really take off? And I hope it does. And honestly, that kind of relates to the best surprise too. So they probably are kind of like a yin and yang type of thing. But I think in my like initial sort of like innocence when starting, you know, I was like, this is such a great idea. This is definitely going to be successful, you know. But it has been like by no means that kind of like walk in the park, you know. Yeah.
I'm curious, like similarly about freelancing. That's a different business you have, right? So you're basically running two businesses at the same time. How did you end up getting your clients for freelancing?
Yeah, for sure. So it is kind of true. I do think like, man, I am kind of like trying to run two businesses right now. How did I put myself in this position? And this is not sustainable. But the good thing about freelancing is that it is a very established path, you know, like the freelancing track like exists. It is a trail that has been traveled many times by many people for many different disciplines and reasons. So what I have been fortunately able to tap into is like these different agencies or networks where once you kind of like go through interviewing with them, you become like an approved freelancer for these different groups. And they basically act as like middlemen / recruiters for you, where they'll find clients and introduce them to you, and you can like have conversations with them. And so that kind of helps with like the challenge, kind of like the key challenge, I think, with freelancing, which is like, how do I get more clients and how do I maintain a constant pipeline of new clients, you know, because it is more temporary work. So they've really helped me to like find my opportunities. And actually I honestly just have one really great client, that Kiva, the nonprofit that I mentioned. I'm just with them on retainer, so I don't have to be as stressed about finding new clients, because I'm basically just with Kiva on a rolling basis. I provide like the same service to them for months. Excuse me. I never sneeze. Yeah, that's the freelancing side of the business for sure. I think it is challenging to just like jumping. It's called context switching. You're like jumping from like working for Decarbon to jumping to working for Kiva to jumping to working with my other client, and that's like another kind of like just time management thing that's hard.
Yeah. Did you have one more slide? I think you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. This one is just for people who are thinking about creating an app. So it's kind of just like the 1, 2, 3. If you want to learn how to create an app, what do you do? Or what do you ask yourself? Like, what do you want to build? Is there something you want to build? What is it? Does it have to be an app? Maybe it could be like a game in the metaverse. I don't know, or something like that. Whatever the medium of choice is, doesn't necessarily need to be an app. But then you create it, and I think just having a bias towards like going down a path, and you'll learn so much more by like doing it versus just like thinking about doing it, if that makes sense. For example, like I did sit on Decarbon and just like mull it over for like 3 years when I could have just like dove in. So like learn how to code. There's some tips on that, like finding a mentor, using walkthroughs, joining communities, and then building like the the simplest version of it to just start getting feedback on it from different people. There's this like general saying for startups, I guess, where you want to talk to at least 100 customers before you really know who your customer is. So like, yeah, feedback is just like obviously super important. And then you keep iterating and hopefully growing and looking for, these signals of validation and traction for whatever concept that you have. Could be a game, could be a climate change app, could be social media, whatever kind of thing. Yeah. You could apply this to anything really, like a nonprofit too.
Yeah, it's a good process for creating in general.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I'll stop my screen.
I feel like, I always have a million follow-up questions for everyone, but we only have a minute left. So I think this is a really good overview. I mean, the one reason I just love hearing your career path specifically is because it was indirect and like
Mm-hmm.
you had a lot of different things that you could have done and
Mm-hmm.
and that you still could do. So it like shows that it's not necessarily just about like choosing your career, going to college for that career, and then there's so many other ways to do it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and like so much uncertainty too, I think, and it is I think good to just like acknowledge that. But that's also part of the beauty of it, I think, too, is that it's like fun to not really know, in my opinion. But yeah, like I think for me, like there's always that question that I like thinking about. It's like if I had a year left to live, what would I do, or like if you could do it all over, what would you do, or like I don't know, things like that. And for me, it's definitely music. Like I wish I could still play music right now. And I was like in a band in college that I loved. It'd be really cool to play music with them again. But that's just how life is. And someday I will pick up music again.
Yeah, really.
All that to say, there's so much uncertainty and randomness to it, and it's good to acknowledge it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, Kyle, for joining us, and thanks to all of the students who attended. And I hope, would you be willing to share your email, or I can share your email with people who are interested?
Yeah, I'll put it here, but if you wanted to share it in other places, you're definitely more than welcome to. But yeah, anyone is welcome to shoot me a note. That's just my Decarbon email.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.